Good morning. My name's David. This is the first time I really got to kind of sit and absorb the music in that little bumper trailer thing. Really reminds me of the stuff that they play like when you're waiting for the dolphin show at SeaWorld to start. I don't know if you understand that reference, but that's kind of where my head went. Before I dive in to whatever this is going to be, like Matt said during the announcements, we seem to have had some success during this series of giving you a little bit of a preview of what's coming to get you hyped and amped so that you show up like not just at all, but on time. So next week, there's going to be a panel of therapists up here, just total geniuses, I've been told, who are, I guess I get to be up here with them, but it's going to be very much like a John the Baptist, like, may I decrease so that they can increase situation. Just going to be lobbing them questions for them to just, spit wisdom at us. So come for that. It's going to be incredible. And then the final week, Kim Honeycutt, who many of you know and love, and I are going to be up here, and it's going to be the Watershed equivalent of, a rap battle. But we're not going to fight. We're going to talk, we're going to, maybe more of a tag team situation. I don't know. I'll work on my metaphors. But it's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to teach a little bit for, a brief amount of time, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. So probably next week, I don't think we have it yet, but next week there's going to be, a form that you can, submit questions in advance. And then also, I'm going to do the thing I always do when I do this, where I stick my phone number on the screen, and you can, text them in live. And our combined, whatever it is we are, will answer your questions about love, relationships, God, the brain, the unconscious, all that stuff. It's formidable, the two of us together. So look forward to that. That's going to be a lot of fun. But today I am going to talk to you about what I thought I was going to do, and was sort of freaking out about it, is I thought I was going to be talking to you about me. And I don't like doing that, because for some reason, weeks ago, I put on we have a sermon calendar that we use to track, who's talking and when and things like that. Because if you've been here for any amount of time, you know that there's not just, one dude, who's standing up here every single week, talking at you. We rotate, and we value that. We value the diversity of identity, the diversity of voices, experiences, areas of expertise, interest, passion. And so we of course, have a Google document to keep track of it all. And I put on, the line item, I guess, for this week, that I'm going to talk about, the relationship that we have with ourselves. And so in the weeks leading up to, this week, I was like, why did I do that? I hate talking about myself. I'm a neurodivergent Enneagram 5 who keeps all of you at bay by having as much information about any number of things I possibly can, so that I can sort of hide behind facts and data and trivia and conversations, which is why I can tell you the complete history of Middle Earth, why I know a lot of obscure statistics around various sporting events that weren't actually important to me, but might be important to you, and we can connect over them. But then I realized I had an epiphany this week. I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about the self, which really means I'm talking about you, because all of you have one, I think. And so we're going to be talking about the self, but I will talk about myself for a second here, just to say that it came to my attention earlier this morning that some of you have not experienced me. And that is fine. But when I'm up here, it looks a little bit like this. This is my approach to talking to you, and really talking in general. I used to write it all down, because you would think, David, that would, that would ground you and organize. No, you'd be getting a 30,000 word dissertation if I was given the entire week to write down everything I could think of to say to you. So I'm sort of saving myself from myself and saving you from myself by just kind of getting up here, and whatever happens. So here we go. So the self. you have one, I have one, we all have one. In smart person or academic terms or whatever, the word that an Austrian friend of mine came up with is the ego. Freud is his name. And the ego is actually a terrible translation. All the ego is just I. So anytime you hear someone talk about the ego, they just mean I. They just mean self. Superego, over I, and the id, which we'll get to. The id is fun. The id just means it, like this mysterious thing, other acting in me and on me and in me, but more than me. But we're going to start with the ego, because that's the easiest one. That's the conscious one. That's the one that we're all wrestling with all the time. And so much of our life is spent figuring out how we understand, how we identify with, how we relate to our ego. And kind of two pieces of the ego that I wanted to spend some time talking about this morning is, because our ego isn't this monolithic thing. On some level, any sense of ego we have, any sense of recognition of ourselves that we have is, well, it's always a misrecognition, right? Like even from the beginning, there's another psychoanalyst, Jacques Lacan, French dude. Don't worry about it. He famously kind of came up with this concept called the mirror stage, where when babies are little, and this isn't just like a one-time thing, but kind of like a period in life when an infant or a child is beginning to get their sense of self. They're seeing themselves in the mirror, their parent or guardian or someone in their life is like, that's you, look how, fill in the blank, and look how cute you are, look how smart you are, look at those eyes, or whatever. And that's when we begin to kind of create our ego. But it's always a misrecognition, because in many ways we're absorbing the projections of others, and even what we're seeing, in the image, both literally in the mirror and kind of more metaphorically, as we're sort of imagining or projecting who our self is, who we are to be. There's always sort of like a little bit of slippage between our experience ourselves and then the experience of us that's reflected back to us by others. And so there's always an element of misrecognition within our sense of self. And then on top of that, there's other elements to our ego, to our I. There's what we might call the ideal ego, which is sort of the image that we sort of project that we want to aspire to, and it's image-based. It often is based on some sort of archetypical example, maybe a person or some conglomerate of persons in our life. Because of my weird relationship to other people, mine is always fictional characters, often cartoons and things like that. My ideal ego is probably a combination of a professional soccer player and a JRPG protagonist, Japanese role-playing game, for the uninitiated. So my wife kind of holds that at bay, helpfully, so that I'm not dressing like steampunk and carrying around katanas and things like that. But I'm only kind of exaggerating here. So you have an ideal ego, an image of yourself that is your best self, your ideal self, and then beneath the surface, kind of getting into this unconscious realm, there's what we might call the ego ideal. And the ego ideal is who we're trying to be our ideal ego for. And by who or what? And it's less a person, maybe more of a concept, maybe more of a value, something that early on in our experience of ourselves, of life, we got a sense of this is the thing that's important. This is the thing that gives me recognition, affirmation, safety, wholeness, security, what have you. And it's going to be in the abstract. It might be personified in particular people in our lives or jobs, positions, experiences, but is this thing that sort of weighs over our ego and our ideal ego that we're striving towards. Very, very closely related to the superego, which a few sermons ago, back in the fall, I identified with Satan. That was fun. You can go see that online. But we'll come back to that, I promise. But so our self, our ego, is made up of all these kind of disparate things. There's the way that we perceive ourselves, which is a mix of recognition and misrecognition. There's who we aspire to be, and then there's who or what we aspire to be that thing for. And so much of our life is meant sort of trying to navigate this, hold all of this in balance and intention in a really healthy way. If you spend time at Watershed for any significant amount of time, you'll inevitably hear us talk about the Enneagram. So if you're familiar with that, if you're not, it's kind of like Myers-Briggs, but for progressive spiritual people. And there's 9 numbers, and each number corresponds with like a different kind of like personality type, kinda. The way that I would want to explain it is your Enneagram number sort of corresponds with your ego ideal. To set another way, kind of if I were to say it a little bit more like churchy or spiritually, your Enneagram number corresponds with your fundamental idolatry. It corresponds with whatever it is you think is going to make you whole. So I'm an Enneagram 5. I am constantly trying to create competency, knowledge, data, information. I gather this stuff, collect it, hoard it, believing that if I just know enough, I will be useful. If I'm competent enough, I'll be needed. I can contribute something, and that'll make me feel whole. Sidebar. Also, there's a belief in me. Kind of this ego ideal thing. There's this belief in me that if I know enough, then like the things in life that are overwhelming to me, like feelings and emotions and other people who have them, I can. If I know enough, I can understand it. I can rationalize it. I can wrap my head around it, and so it creates this comfortable buffer. And so in many contexts, the Enneagram is often approached as like, okay, yeah, now you know what kind of makes you whole, and so you can like pursue that in a healthy way, and it's like, whatever. For me, understanding your Enneagram type as a kind of fundamental idolatry is really helpful, because rather than use it to figure out how I become whole or complete or the best version of myself, the way that I've come to understand it is it tells me what I need to die to in order to be free of that fundamental idolatry. Now, here's the thing. As an Enneagram 5, and most of you are not 5s. That's just true statistically. Most of you are actually 6s, probably, statistically speaking. A 5 would know that. But it's not so much that I need to like punt into the atmosphere this love of knowledge and data, but rather to die to it frees me from this being the fundamental thing that defines me, that I think is going to make me whole. And by the way, it's not. You can't save yourself. Whatever it is you think is going to make you whole is going to disappoint you. It's going to be some sort of cosmic buyer's remorse that you experience, and you're going to end up being melancholy about it, but we'll get to that. No, you don't get rid of it. You die to it so that it can return to you as a gift that you then steward, not to keep people at bay, but to love people and to help people, happy stuff. So I want to unpack that a little bit. And in order to do that, we're going to hang out with the Apostle Paul, kind of a stodgy fellow, but just to set the stage a little bit, I'm going to be looking at 2 relatively famous passages in Romans, and I'm going to be doing something that you probably grew up being told you should never do. I'm going to take them out of context. And so in order to reconcile that in my head, which is something I need to do, just to give you a little bit of context, so Paul, most of what Paul is doing, but especially in Romans and Galatians, 2 of his maybe more famous books, in the Bible, his maybe most famous book, Paul is trying to reconcile the place of the people of Israel, the Jewish people, as God's chosen people, and the promises that were given to them by God in the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, with this more inclusive, sort of universal invitation that all can be right with God, reconciled with God, saved through Christ, through Jesus. And he's trying to thread the needle, hold the tension, kind of whatever metaphor you want to use, corporate speak, about like, okay, how can both of these things be true at the same time? Paul's trying to find a both and between the people of Israel remain the chosen people of God, and in Christ, like everyone's chosen. This is great. And so that's the context for what he's wrestling with. And so in just a second, I'm going to share a passage in Romans 7 and a passage in Romans 8. And this is, in context, this is all part of that same argument. However, I do think that there is a sense in which what Paul is experiencing and naming in certain ways transcends that particular argument and can be relatable to our trying to figure out what it is to have a self, to have an ego, and to exist with other humans. So that's the context. So the first verse I want to look at is in Romans chapter 7, and I came prepared with my phone in case I can't read it from here. Yeah, I can't. So here's what it says. This is verse 15. You've probably heard this before if you've been at one of those churches that takes 7 years to go through the book of Romans. So hit a little close to home for a few of you. So here's what it says. It says, I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do. Sorry, I got a text. But what I hate to do, I do. All right? And in the context, he's wrestling with how sin and the Jewish law relates to each other. And I'm going to really, really resist the temptation to go off on that rabbit trail because that would be fun for me, but it would take us too far afield. So we've all experienced, at least in the abstract, something like this. Like, we think like we know what we want to do, and then we like self-sabotage. Which is why that we have smartphones with apps and stuff like that. Just another thing about me, if we're supposed to hang out and I didn't put it in iCal, we're not going to hang out. Like, I'm not going to remember that. I might try to remember it. I have done that. I've been like, you know what? That seems tedious to pull my phone out right now. And I really hate like when you're trying to like scroll down on iCal, maybe some of you have experienced this, and you're trying to say like alert at time of event. But like as you try to scroll down, it changes the time by accident because it's like a little scroll bar. And then I'm paranoid about that constantly because, like I said, if it doesn't remind me, and I'm always like, what's the best reminder? Like 2 days before, 30 minutes before, like 2 days. 'Cause 2 days might be too early. But if it's something, I don't know, it's tough. But we do these things because we self-sabotage. And that's one example. Another example might be, you have like a big interview coming up, and you're all prepared, and like in a weird way, kind of preparing ends up undermining your efforts. I mean, even what I was describing before about my whole speaking style or whatever is happening right now, is a little bit my attempt to like outwit my own unconscious, to be like, all right, like if I wrote it all down, then I'm going to end up like trying to teach a seminary class to these people, and no one signed up for that. So how do I free myself, and by extension for you? And so we've all experienced this, right? And at least when Paul's talking about it, he's frustrated by this, and I understand why this is frustrating. I've been frustrated by this. I'm sure you've been frustrated by this, but what I kind of want to get at is maybe this idea that maybe this isn't such a bad thing, okay? Because going back to that idea about ego and ego ideal and ideal ego, a lot of that comes at us from the outside, right? And don't get me wrong, sometimes there's healthy things that we're aspiring towards. Like what I was talking about before, like the kind of outfit I want to wear would look really cool and wouldn't hurt anyone. Maybe my wife a little bit. But and it's not bad sometimes to, want to be healthier, whatever that means, mentally, physically, spiritually healthier. And oftentimes the things that we're aspiring to they're not objectively bad or harmful in any way. However, it's our relationship to them. We think that they're going to fix us, that they're going to make us whole, that they're going to make us complete. And so we end up in this sort of endless cycle of like striving for these things and then maybe failing to get them and experiencing a kind of depression or disappointment about that. Or worse, we get them. We achieve them. And then it's like, oh, well, that's it? Like if you've seen the recent, relatively recent COVID time, so it's probably like 5 years ago, but anyway, the Pixar movie Soul, regardless, like earmuffs, if you haven't seen it, it's been out long enough, like statute of limitations is gone. Like, there's a scene where the main character, I'm not going to give too much context, where he achieves his dream. And then he's standing out on the curb next to his idol, his hero, and he's like, all right, what's next? And she's like, what do you mean? He's like, well, what happens next? And she's like, go get some sleep, come back tomorrow, we're going to do it again. Which is fine, which is great, but in the moment he's like, I always imagined that there would be more. I always imagined that when I finally got this thing, everything would kind of click into place like a puzzle that only makes sense when you stick that final piece in there and it all becomes clear. But that's not really how we're wired. That's not really how life works. And so My theory here, my suggestion, my conviction, if I'm being honest, is that maybe it's not always a bad thing that we don't always do what we want to do and vice versa. Paul could use Grammarly. And so there's this other verse that happens a chapter later in chapter 8. Paul's argument is continued, and you've perhaps heard this one before too. It says, so in the same ways, okay, so he's just talked about this hope that he has, in the future, but he's sort of juxtaposed this hope with and the patience that we need to have for it with pain. He uses childbirth metaphors, which, to be honest, Paul, it's a little presumptuous. But yeah, I just haven't experienced that. Neither have I. But anyway, he's talking about just the tension, the pain, but it's going to be worth it in the end. And he says, in the same way, in verse 26, chapter 8, he says, in the same way the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he, or it, we're going to get to that, he or it who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. So how does this fit? Okay, so bonus points for those of you who just went through Reclamation with me. You've heard this before, but those of you who haven't, prayer to me it's more than just a thing that you do. It's a posture that you take on. It's a posture of vulnerability. Prayer is absurd, y'all. It doesn't make any sense. It's not utilitarian in any way. We live these utilitarian lives where everything we do is sort of like towards the trajectory of like more success, more, wholeness, more, actualization. We download apps, we learn life hacks, we do all these things. And again, some of these are fine. They're even healthy. Some of them are necessary, at least provisionally, because of maybe some of the harm, trauma, or abuse that we've experienced. So don't hear me demonizing just like in a black and white binary way some of these things. But, when we get so convinced that all of our kind of ills and stuff can be dealt with by shoring up our defenses in this way, by maximizing whatever it is that we think is going to ultimately give us purpose, meaning, completeness, what have you, then we're going to just get caught in that cycle of like striving and disappointment that I was talking about. And there is some wisdom then in almost like beating life to the punch, so to speak. The biblical language for this is dying to self in some way. Prayer, it sort of embodies this. It's a practice. It is quite literally, it's a posture of vulnerability. I mean, literally, think about the way that we stereotypically like posture ourselves in prayer. Like on your knees, like you're exposing your neck, you're closing your eyes, you're binding your hands, you're vulnerable. You are on some level, even by asking some invisible higher power to help you with something, you're acknowledging that on some level on your own, there's an insufficiency. And I don't mean that in some sort of self-deprecating way. There's lots of, all of you are strong, and I don't mean that in a patronizing way. Just conceptually, the openness of prayer is a kind of acknowledgement of vulnerability. It runs counter to like everything our culture and life and phone is trying to tell us. And it's hard to acknowledge that sometimes. And so in comes Romans 8, 26 through 27, and Paul coming in saying sometimes there's this force, this energy, this spirit that kind of does it for us. Maybe that ends up looking a little bit like self-sabotage. Maybe that ends up looking a little bit like, sort of just like messing with this thing that we think is going to make us whole before we have a chance to achieve it and realize that it didn't. In this way, just like in that sermon I referenced a few months ago, in this way that the superego, which stands over us and makes this demand upon us, demands that, if you just X, fill in the blank, you're going to be whole. If you just overcome this, or if you just, if you just demonize that person, That's why I sort of identified the superego with the person of Satan, promising all the way back in the garden, promising, if you just divide the world just like this, knowledge of good and evil, you'll be like God. If you could just put everything in this binary, in, out, right, wrong, pure, impure, you're going to be okay. The spirit is kind of similar to the id in the sense that the id is this part of our unconscious that comes in and undermines us. And we often think of it in these like almost animalistic or instinctual ways. That's how my conservative evangelical health book in private school taught it. It's like, this is like your animal instinct, but that both doesn't do justice to the invention of it, like historically, in psychology and psychoanalysis, but it also doesn't do justice to our experience. The id is sort of this infinite well of possibility that breaks through the limits that we put on ourselves. And those limits often manifest in words and language and names. Think about how the self works. Think about how names work, how words work. To name something, to call it something, is to differentiate it from all other things. So on some level, whatever sense of self we have, it requires an other that is not us to make sense of it, right? To say that I am David is to say that I am, not any of you. To say that this is that. But the moment that we make a claim about what something is, we realize that that doesn't quite capture it. Because there's always more to the thing. There's certainly always more to you and I than the label or the name or the identity. So with every name, every nomination, there has to be this negation, this denomination. And yes, that has created many religious headaches over the years, but in denominations. But insofar as it relates to us and ourself and our being, I think it's a reflection of the infinite divine within us. And so this longing that we feel, to constantly make ourselves whole, to constantly find the thing, whatever it is that's gonna complete us, the thing that the superego is promising us we can do, the thing that we are striving for as it relates to our ego ideal to finally be saved, is an attempt to find some sort of us-shaped box that we fit in perfectly. It's an attempt to make us finite, but we're not finite. We're infinite. We're both. But in some sort of paradoxical way, our infinity, our divinity, the image of God within us is found precisely in our messy humanity. I forgot to cue the band. Band, you guys can come back up. I promised them I would do that, and then I spaced it. But no, like we create, again, this binary that if we can only be complete in our humanity, complete in our finitude, well, then maybe that's the thing that'll make us worthy of God. But if there is a message in the Bible, and I think there's at least a few, but if there's at least one all the way through, it's that there's not some deficiency in your humanity that you need to overcome in order to be made right with God. From the very beginning, God has identified God's self, has appeared in and as this messy bursting through of the divine within us. And there's lots of really kind of fun, complicated Enneagram 5 sort of academic ways that I could explain it to you. But I'm looking at the clock and realizing that wouldn't be the best use of our time. The way that the Bible describes this, the word that the Bible uses to name this thing that I'm talking about, is just love. Love is this weird thing where we kind of empty ourselves. And love is like the one word, the one name that we can use that doesn't work like the other names and words do. Whereas other words are words of, typically they're words of mastery. We're trying to bound or box something in so that we can understand it, we can control it. And the beautiful thing about that is it never works, and things are always exceeding and more and greater than our attempts to define them. It's kind of this frustrating, beautiful thing about language, but love is different because on some level, whatever we mean by love, when we're really embodying it, love is a kind of self-emptying. We are, in this weird way, elevating the other above ourselves, but in doing so, we're sort of freeing ourselves, because it creates a kind of vulnerability, we're freeing ourselves to be who we really always, already, authentically were. It's this weird paradox, the human and the divine, within us. And so, I guess kind of what I want to leave you with is, and this isn't going to be terribly profound. What I want to leave you with is this idea of love, but I want to frame it. How do I want to frame it? I want to frame it as, I'll put it this way. The Bible gives us these virtue words. And I've been asked, sometimes by Austin actually, I've been asked, you have all these ideas, the Charlie Day thing. You have all these ideas, but what does it look like to make them practical? And that's not always my strength. That's not always what I'm good at. But over the last couple of years, I've really kind of glommed on to some of these words that seem to repeat themselves in the Bible. Words like faith, hope, joy, grace, and love. And there's something like paradoxical about all of these words. And what I mean by that is they don't fit cleanly into our kind of binary, kind of self-help, like improve yourself culture. Because they're messy words. Joy isn't as simple as like happiness, which is kind of maybe this fleeting moment of pleasure or experience. Like there's a lament to joy. It kind of asks that we include within it the struggles of life. It's sort of a nevertheless embrace of the abundance of life in the face of all of those things. Like the very concept of resurrection in the New Testament is a joyful concept in that it, in no way does resurrection like undo it doesn't undo the death of Christ, but it kind of goes through it and comes out the other side as something new. There's a word, he's dead, it's finished, and then that limit bursts open as something new is reborn on the other side. And the other words kind of work the same way, and so is love. So love it's a posture, it's a technology in a certain way. But here's the crucial thing. So much of our experience of life is sort of this promise that if we sacrifice this or sacrifice that or sacrifice them, we'll be able to overcome this lack that we feel, and we'll finally be made whole, and that's that cycle I was talking about. And in a weird way, love kind of follows the same logic. It does involve a sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice of ourselves, but not in some sort of self-deprecating way, because we're almost able to it's like a parody or a trick. We're offering up that piece of ourselves that in many ways is a lie. You can sacrifice the ideal ego, or really you're sacrificing the ego ideal. You're sacrificing that thing that actually is what keeps you apart from others. You're sacrificing that thing that you use to buffer yourself against the other. And you're made vulnerable, but in that vulnerability, that's the thing that actually allows you to be with and for one another. But even before then, even before you're made free to be with and for the other, and this is crucial, you're made to be with and for yourself. So in that famous passage where Jesus says, the greatest commandment, love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. The reason those need to be really tied together, inextricably bound, is because what Jesus understood from the very beginning is to love the Lord your God is, on some level, to love yourself. To elevate that vulnerable, authentic part of yourself above whatever idolatrous thing that you're striving for or clinging to that you think is going to make you whole. And remember, like when I was talking about the Enneagram, that thing might be fine. It just can't be God. And when you love God and by extension love yourself, love the divinity within you in this sort of authentically vulnerable way, then you're free. Free to see the vulnerable other in front of you as they are, not as something to be overcome, to be appropriated, to be kept at bay, but sort of this messy kind of collective, all of you together. Oh, which, by the way, the whole 2 or 3 are gathered thing, that's how the New Testament envisions the Holy Spirit, the presence of God with us. And so for you psychology nerds out here, that's kind of how the id works. I'm not saying that the id and the Holy Spirit are the same thing. I'm just saying they've never been in the same room together, never been seen that way. So chew on that. But no, that's what I want to leave you with this morning is something as simple as love, loving your neighbor, loving God. Loving yourself is not in contradiction with that. In fact, it's precisely the contradiction of it that we need to meditate on that makes us free. So I leave you with love, and in doing so, I leave you with yourself. Thanks.